December 23rd, 1944, 11:45 hours. Seneps Hill, Belgium. A German observer from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division steadied his binoculars, though his hands shook despite the cold. What he saw unfolding above him would permanently alter his understanding of the war. Just before noon, the clouds finally broke. For days, bad weather had starved the encircled American defenders of Bastogne. Now the sky itself seemed to come alive. More than 200 C-47 transport aircraft appeared overhead, flying in disciplined formations. It was the first large-scale aerial resupply of the trapped 101st Airborne Division. This is impossible, he thought. The sky was filled with aircraft, far beyond anything a desperate army should be capable of assembling. Not a handful of planes slipping through the clouds, but a vast airborne convoy stretching from horizon to horizon. Through the observation periscope, he watched colored parachutes blossom across the frozen Belgian countryside. Red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for everything else needed to keep an army alive. The entire Luftwaffe could no longer mount an operation of this magnitude. It hadn't been able to since Stalingrad, 2 years earlier. Yet here, over one small town, the Americans were openly displaying an air power and logistical capacity that surpassed anything the Third Reich had ever achieved, even at its peak. Veterans of countless campaigns stood silently in their siege positions. They were witnessing something more decisive than tanks or artillery. The arithmetic of defeat was being written in cargo loads, flight schedules, and sheer industrial scale. This was not about courage or tactics anymore. It was about an empire confronting the reality that it could no longer compete. Only a week earlier, confidence had been absolute. On December 16th, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., the German offensive opened with a devastating 90-minute artillery barrage. More than 1,600 guns thundered along a front nearly 130 kilometers wide. Operation Walk am Rhein, Hitler's final gamble, aimed to split the Allied armies and seize Antwerp, forcing a negotiated peace in the West. At first, it seemed to work. On the night of December 15th, troops moved forward under cover of darkness. The narrow forest roads of the Eifel were jammed with men and vehicles, many sliding over ice as they struggled toward their jump-off positions. The soldiers were told this was Germany's moment of destiny. The Führer himself had planned the attack. The Americans, they were assured, were weak, inexperienced, and complacent. Units sent to the Ardennes to rest. History would repeat itself. Just like 1940, the German army would cut through the enemy and decide the war in weeks. Among those advancing was Generalmajor Heinz Kokott's 26th Volksgrenadier Division, rebuilt after its destruction on the Eastern Front. It was a shell of its former self. A small core of hardened veterans from Russia and Normandy remained, but most of the ranks were filled with former Luftwaffe ground crews and naval personnel, men with little infantry training, sent forward to fill gaps in a shrinking army. And now, on December 23rd, under a clearing winter sky, those men watched American supplies fall freely from the heavens. The storm they had unleashed was no longer under their control. Despite the patchwork nature of the division, confidence ran high. The men had been assured they would receive modern weapons, sufficient supplies, and, most importantly, total surprise. Early success appeared to confirm every promise. To the Americans, the opening blows looked like nothing more than the expected limited counterattack. Instead, the Wehrmacht achieved complete tactical surprise. American frontline positions collapsed under the initial shock. Some units were overwhelmed outright. Others withdrew westward in confusion. In those first days, the road network leading to Antwerp appeared dangerously exposed. The race toward Bastogne was on. By December 18th, German spearheads were advancing at a remarkable pace. General Otto von Manchefeld, commanding 5th Panzer Army, assigned General Heinrich Freyer von Luttwitz, XLEI Panzer Corps the task of seizing Bastogne before pushing on toward the Meuse near Namur. The logic behind the plan was brutally straightforward. 7 major highways converged on Bastogne. Whoever controlled that crossroads controlled the American logistical system in the Ardennes. Without Bastogne, U.S. forces would be unable to move reinforcements, sustain their units, or organize an effective counterattack. On paper, The operation was bold but entirely achievable. Luttwitz planned to assault a front roughly 7 to 11 kilometers wide using 3 divisions. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the 2nd Panzer Division would spearhead the attack, with the Panzerlehr Division following in support. These were not green formations. They were battle-hardened units, veterans of multiple campaigns, still equipped with some of Germany's best remaining tanks and assault guns. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division advanced with particular resolve. Its Panzerjäger Battalion was fully equipped, fielding 14 Trachhetzer tank destroyers, along with an impressive number of 75mm anti-tank guns. By Ardennes standards, the 26th was among the best-armed Volksgrenadier divisions in the sector. They were prepared for American armor, for fierce counterattacks, for anything except what they were about to face. As they closed in on Bastogne, subtle warning signs began to appear. The Americans were not fleeing in chaos. They were executing control withdrawals, demolishing bridges, erecting roadblocks, and forcing the German advance to pay in time and blood for every kilometer gained. Units like Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division fought delaying actions that proved decisive. They held the Germans just long enough for the leading elements of the 101st Airborne Division to reach Bastogne, arriving only 4 hours ahead of the foremost German units. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been resting near Reims, France, when the offensive began. Within hours, they were loaded onto trucks and driven through the night toward the threatened crossroads. They arrived exhausted, short on winter equipment, and were immediately thrown into defensive positions. But they arrived in time, and that fact alone would change the course of the battle. The encirclement. By December 20th, German forces had closed in around Bastogne. By midday on December 21st, all 7 roads leading into the town were severed. By nightfall, both sides understood the reality. The mixed force of airborne and armored infantry inside Bastogne was completely surrounded. The trap had closed. Inside the pocket were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, along with various supporting units. Cut off, outnumbered, and short on supplies, they now faced the full weight of the German offensive. Inside the perimeter were roughly 22,000 American soldiers. They were outnumbered by nearly 5 to 1 and were critically short winter clothing, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Command and control was also weakened. Many senior officers were absent, including the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Major General Maxwell Taylor, who was away when the crisis erupted. From the German point of view, the situation looked like Stalingrad turned on its head. This time it was the Americans who were surrounded, cut off, isolated, and seemingly condemned to surrender or be destroyed. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the XLVI Panzer Corps, was completely certain of the outcome. He had been in France in 1940 and had witnessed the collapse of encircled Allied forces at Dunkirk. He believed he was seeing the same pattern repeat itself. Encircled armies, in his experience, always broke. Morale eroded. Supplies ran out. Resistance ended. Intelligence estimates suggested the defenders in Bastogne had no more than 3 days of ammunition and perhaps 4 days of food if it was carefully rationed. The winter itself would finish the job. Temperatures plunged to nearly minus 10 degrees Celsius, and exposure would claim as many victims as bullets. Confidence was so high that, after sealing off Bastogne, the 2 panzer divisions of the XLVI Panzer Corps resumed their advance toward the Meuse on December 22nd rather than concentrating their full strength on crushing the pocket. Only a single regiment was left behind to support the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in reducing the town. Why waste tanks and fuel on a position that would collapse on its own? The real objective was Antwerp. Bastogne was an inconvenience, an obstacle that cold, hunger, and time would eliminate without further effort. From December 16th through December 22nd, the weather had been Germany's greatest ally. Low cloud ceilings, freezing fog, and snowfall kept the dreaded Allied air forces grounded. For the first time since Normandy, German units could maneuver in daylight, without fear of fighter bombers. Troop concentrations went unseen. Movements went unpunished. The crushing air attacks that had annihilated so many German formations in France simply did not come. Inside Bastogne, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Some artillery pieces had no high-explosive rounds remaining. Others were down to a handful of shells. Food stocks were gone. Soldiers scavenged what they could from wrecked vehicles and abandoned supply dumps. Medical shortages were severe. Men died from wounds that would normally have been survivable with proper care. The ultimatum. On December 22nd, convinced that surrender was inevitable, the Germans delivered their demand. The moment unfolded with almost ceremonial precision. Late in the morning, around 11:30, a small party of 4 German soldiers approached the American lines along the Arlon Road, coming from the direction of Remo, south of Bastogne. 2 white flags were raised. The senior officer was Major Wagner of the ex-LVI Panzer Corps. Beside him walked Lieutenant Helmut Henke of the Panzer Lehr Operations Staff, a briefcase tucked under his arm. They even carried blindfolds, fully expecting to be escorted to the American commander to negotiate terms. Inside the briefcase was a formally worded ultimatum, typed in both German and English, polite in structure, but unmistakably threatening in its message. The tide begins to turn. The fortunes of war were shifting. This time, it was American forces in and around Bastogne who found themselves surrounded by powerful German armored formations. Additional German panzer units had crossed the Arles River near Otteville, captured Marquet, and advanced to St. Hubert by moving through Hargemont and nearby routes. The German message demanded an honorable surrender within 2 hours, warning that total destruction would follow if the offer was rejected. From their perspective, they believed they were being fair, offering the Americans a chance to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. When the American reply arrived, it contained only a single word: nuts. The German command was genuinely confused. Acting American Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had reportedly responded with the blunt remark, nuts, an expression that initially puzzled the German officers. Lieutenant Henke required clarification from Colonel Harper, who explained that in plain English, it essentially meant go to hell. At German headquarters, the response caused disbelief and frustration. No encircled force had ever dismissed a surrender demand so casually. Generalmajor Heinz Kokott was reportedly stunned. In post-war interrogations, he would later admit, "We offered honorable terms. We had them surrounded 5-1. No supplies could reach them. To refuse seemed not courageous, but insane." Clear skies returned, December 23, 1944. The morning of December 23rd brought something the Germans had not seen in over a week. Clear skies. Weather conditions finally improved, allowing Allied air forces to resume operations. German soldiers climbed out of their frozen foxholes, briefly grateful for sunlight that might thaw their numbed hands and feet. Many had endured a brutal night in sub-zero temperatures, their weapons stiff with ice and their bodies drained by the cold. Then they heard it, a distant rumble, growing louder by the minute, rolling across the hills surrounding Bastogne. At 6:45 a.m. on December 23rd, aircraft carrying 2 Pathfinder teams lifted off from Charles Airfield, bound for Belgium. These men were the advance guides, tasked with marking the drop zones for the main aerial resupply effort. They parachuted into the area at 9:35 a.m., were quickly secured by American troops, and immediately began setting up their signaling equipment. By 11:50 a.m., soldiers along the front could see the aircraft approaching. For the Americans, it was the most uplifting moment of the entire siege, a sign of survival and hope. For the Germans, it marked the realization that they had made a grave miscalculation. The main aerial armada arrived at 11:50 a.m. 241C, 47 transport planes, flying in disciplined formations at roughly 1,000 feet. They approached in waves, each formation dropping supplies in sequence. The sky soon filled with multicolored parachutes, each color representing a different category of urgently needed supplies. The flak barrage, German anti-aircraft crews rushed into action. The feared 88mm flak guns, the pride of German artillery, pivoted skyward. Rapid-fire 20mm cannons opened up. Machine guns joined in, creating a deafening storm of fire. The sky erupted with black bursts of exploding shells as flak detonated around the aircraft. After one especially violent explosion, McNeese and Sergeant Mertz instinctively flinched. The battle for Bastogne had entered a new phase. A jagged hole torn through the fuselage revealed how narrowly death had missed them. An enemy shell had passed between the two men, separated by only inches. Yet the American aircraft flew straight into a storm of fire, holding their formations with a resolve that bordered on reckless defiance. 14 C-47s were lost either en route or over the drop zones, brought down by flak, or crippled badly enough to crash later. Still, for every aircraft that fell, dozens more pressed forward, doors yawning open as supply bundles spilled into the frigid December air. German troops watched in disbelief as damaged planes, engines trailing smoke, wings shredded by shrapnel, stayed on course long enough to complete their drops before peeling away or plunging into the forest. One transport, its tail section completely ablaze, flew directly over German lines. The crew continued kicking out supply bundles until the final seconds, moments before the aircraft nosed down and disappeared into the trees. The arithmetic of abundance. What followed was a demonstration of American logistics that broke German morale more effectively than any artillery bombardment ever could. The parachutes descended like a blizzard of color, thousands upon thousands drifting gently onto the snow-covered fields around Bastogne. For the paratroopers below, the sight was pure relief and renewed hope. For the Germans watching from their positions, it was something else entirely, a sinking realization. This was not the frantic effort of a doomed garrison. It was a routine output of an industrial war machine operating without visible limits. German intelligence officers scrambled to observe and record what was being delivered. Red parachutes signaled artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition. Blue marked medical supplies, surgical instruments, plasma, morphine. Yellow brought food, K-rations, D-rations, canned goods. White parachutes carried blankets, winter uniforms, boots, gloves. Green indicated radios, batteries, and signal equipment. Orange parachutes delivered 5-gallon cans of gasoline. By nightfall, a single battalion reported stocks of over 528,000 rations and 250 gallons of fuel. Ammunition level stood at E-286, WP-177, and at 201, and this was only one unit's accounting. Multiply those figures across every formation inside Bastogne, and the scale became almost impossible to grasp. And the drops did not stop. Throughout December 23rd, additional missions followed. At 2 p.m., another wave arrived, this time including gliders towed by C-47s, carrying loads too heavy to be dropped by parachute. 92 tons of supplies, including nearly 3,000 gallons of gasoline, were landed by glider. These aircraft delivered complete surgical facilities, doctors, nurses, operating tables, and equipment. They brought jeeps, communications gear, and even replacement artillery pieces. One glider carried nothing but whole blood for transfusions, a medical capability the German army could not provide even for its most senior officers. German medical personnel, observing through binoculars, were stunned. While they struggled to treat wounded soldiers with paper bandages, sawdust dressings, and surgeries performed without anesthesia, the Americans were flying in refrigerated blood, penicillin, and full surgical teams. The disparity in medical care alone was enough to crush morale. By late afternoon, Pathfinder teams had marked multiple drop zones, and the supply aircraft arrived with mechanical precision. In some sectors, artillery units were firing ammunition at German positions almost immediately, using shells that had landed only minutes earlier, before the drop zones had even been fully cleared. The siege was no longer tightening. It was unraveling. American artillery crews were firing rounds that had been drifting down beneath parachutes only minutes earlier. The supplies were barely on the ground before they were being turned back against the enemy. The fighter bombers returned. As devastating as the transport armada had been, the clearing skies brought something even more terrifying for the Germans: the return of American air power in its most lethal form. P-47 Thunderbolts roared into the battle area, diving low over German columns. Their 8.50 caliber machine guns hammered the roads, while rockets screamed from under their wings. They attacked anything that moved: supply trucks, horse-drawn artillery, lone vehicles, even small groups of soldiers caught in the open. Every road became a killing zone. Any movement in daylight invited destruction. German forces that had maneuvered freely for an entire week were suddenly frozen in place. Supply columns moving toward the front were caught in the open and methodically wiped out. The shock was immediate and crushing. Only days earlier, German soldiers had believed victory was within reach. Now they were abruptly reminded of Normandy, of an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority that it could afford to hunt individual vehicles from the air. The collapse of confidence. By nightfall on December 23rd, the psychological shift among the German besiegers was complete. What they had witnessed was not merely a resupply operation, but a blunt display of industrial and logistical power beyond anything they could hope to match. The numbers told a grim story. If the Americans could risk hundreds of aircraft and crews to supply a single encircled division, what depth of reserves must they possess? If they could deliver hundreds of tons of supplies in flawless coordination on short notice, what did that say about their true industrial strength? Hope was evaporating. Christmas Eve, a final gamble. December 24th brought snow and cloud cover once again, grounding the Allied air fleets. German commanders seized on the weather, hoping it might restore their advantage. On Christmas Eve, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division was reinforced with a Panzer Grenadier regiment from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. This was their last opportunity. Bastogne had to fall before the skies cleared again. Lacking sufficient manpower, and with the troops of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division nearing exhaustion, the XLVI Panzer Corps devised a focused plan. Rather than attacking the perimeter everywhere at once, they would strike selected points along the western edge in sequence, concentrating their strength where they believed the American defenses were weakest. The main effort would come from the northwest. Christmas morning assault. In the darkness before dawn on December 25th, Christmas Day, the Germans launched a renewed all-out assault aimed at crushing the Bastogne pocket once and for all. At approximately 1800 hours, for tanks supported by infantry smashed through the thin defensive line held by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and pushed forward toward Hemmerl. For a brief moment, success seemed possible. The armor broke through, and German infantry poured to the gap behind them. For an instant, it appeared that Bastogne might finally fall. German infantry pushed forward through the snow, convinced that this final effort would shatter the American defenses. What met them instead was a wall of fire, disciplined, sustained, and fueled by the ammunition that had rained down from the sky just 2 days earlier. 2 tanks managed to survive the initial destruction inflicted by the 463rd Artillery Battalion. But their escape was brief. A mobile armored force rushed forward by division headquarters, intercepted and destroyed them. Of the 18 tanks that launched the assault that morning, not a single one remained operational by nightfall. The breaking point. December 26 marked the decisive end of German hopes around Bastogne. On that day, the siege was finally broken. As darkness gathered shortly after 1700 hours on December 26th, a spearhead from the 4th Armored Division, along with other elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army, forced its way through German positions south of town. Combat Command of the 4th Armored Division opened a narrow but vital corridor into Bastogne, and in the encirclement, the first American tanks to roll into the battered town belonged to the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later go on to command U.S. forces in Vietnam. They found the defenders exhausted, frostbitten, and worn down, but unbroken, supplied by air confident in their mission, and fully prepared to continue the fight. The numbers tell the story. Statistics convey the reality of Bastogne more starkly than any personal recollection. According to U.S. Army records, during the siege, more than 1,200 tons of supplies and equipment were delivered to the 101st Airborne Division by air. This included approximately 4,900 gallons of gasoline dropped by parachute, along with an additional 92 tons of cargo, including 2,975 gallons of fuel, delivered by glider, broken down by day. December 23rd, 241 C-47s conducted the primary resupply mission, supported by additional flights. December 24th, operations were limited due to weather. December 25th, Poor conditions prevented major air activity. December 26th to 27th. Resupply continued even after ground contact had been re-established. In total, more than 1,100 tons of supplies were flown in. This included over 15,000 artillery rounds, nearly 8,000 gallons of gasoline, extensive medical supplies for the wounded, food sufficient for 15,000 men, and winter clothing for the entire garrison. Now, compare this to the German effort. German forces surrounding Bastogne numbered approximately 54,000 troops. The American defenders inside the perimeter numbered roughly 22,000. German aircraft sorties over Bastogne amounted to fewer than 100 flights. American sorties exceeded 2,000. German aerial resupply deliveries, 0. Professional judgment. Post-war analyses by German military professionals confirmed what frontline soldiers had already grasped intuitively. General der Panzertruppe Otto von Manchefeld, commander of the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes Offensive, reflected in his post-war writings and interviews that Bastogne demonstrated something decisive. The Americans had solved the central problem of modern warfare, logistics. They could supply encircled forces by air more effectively than Germany could supply advancing armies by road. When the weather cleared, American material superiority became overwhelming. Tactical skill alone could no longer compensate for that imbalance. Generalmajor Heinz Kokott, described by Colonel S.L.A. Marshall as reserved, intellectual, and measured, a commander who never raised his voice and weighed his decisions carefully, offered perhaps the most concise judgment during his post-war interrogation. Bastogne, he concluded, was not lost by bravery or tactics. It was lost by arithmetic. Kokott's conclusion was unmistakable. When the transport aircraft filled the skies on December 23rd, every German soldier who witnessed the scene understood the deeper reality. They were no longer fighting merely an opposing army. They were confronting an entire industrial civilization, while they themselves were still relying on rifles, horses, and dwindling resources. The post-war meeting with Colonel Harry Kinnard left a lasting impression on the German commanders. It was genuinely unsettling for them to discover that this youthful-looking officer had been one of their primary adversaries during the siege. When Kokott met Kinnard, who had served as the 101st Airborne Division's G3 Operations officer at Bastogne, he was openly astonished. Lutwich reportedly asked in disbelief, "Are you certain he was the chief of operations? Could he not have been responsible for only a single regiment?" The broader impact. The psychological effect of the Bastogne airlift spread rapidly throughout German units across the Ardennes front. Every formation included soldiers who had either seen the resupply firsthand or heard detailed accounts from comrades who had. With each retelling, the story grew more dramatic, but its central truth remained unchanged. America possessed material resources far beyond anything Germany could hope to match. The bitter irony, perhaps the cruelest irony for the German forces, was that they themselves had created the conditions for this psychological collapse. By choosing to encircle Bastogne, they forced the Americans to reveal the full extent of their aerial supply capability. Had the town been bypassed, as some planners originally intended, German troops might never have witnessed this overwhelming demonstration of industrial power. Aftermath. Following December 26, German operations around Bastogne deteriorated into costly, desperate attacks that achieved little. Despite the reality on the ground, Hitler continued to demand that Bastogne be taken as quickly as possible. He could not accept the idea that a surrounded American force had not only survived, but had effectively shattered the offensive's momentum. They had not merely endured the siege, they had emerged from it better supplied and more combat-ready than before it began. On December 29th, German command committed fresh forces to the struggle. Units from the 6th Panzer Army began feeding reinforcements into the fight, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. More formations followed, thrown one after another into the grinder. The 9th SS Panzer Division, the Führer Escort Brigade, and the 167th Volksgrenadier Division all attacked American positions that were now fully resupplied, reinforced, and firmly held. Each assault ended the same way: heavy German losses, no breakthrough. The final major German offensive against Bastogne began on January 4th. It collapsed almost immediately. German troops attacked the same defensive positions repeatedly, gaining nothing except longer casualty lists. Courage was no longer the issue. Reality was, what those German soldiers had witnessed over Bastogne was only a small glimpse of American industrial power. They could not have known that the Douglas C-47 was a backbone of Allied airborne logistics, used extensively in operations Overlord, Dragoon, Market Garden, and Varsity. More than 10,000 C-47s were produced during the war. American factories were turning out aircraft at a pace Germany simply could not match. Over 50,000 paratroopers were delivered into combat by these aircraft during the conflict. Historical confirmation. Time has confirmed the psychological impact of the Bastogne airlift on German forces. Military historians now regard it as a decisive moment, not only in the Battle of the Bulge, but as proof of the futility of conventional warfare against overwhelming industrial capacity. The official U.S. Army history notes a clear shift in tone during German prisoner interrogations after December 23rd, before the air resupply. Captured soldiers spoke of temporary difficulties and eventual success. After witnessing the aerial armada, they spoke only of survival and of hoping the war would end soon. Between December 19, 1944 and January 6, 1945, the 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered by roughly 5-1, their losses were comparatively light. Clear evidence of how air supply preserved their fighting strength. The ultimate lesson. The 101st Airborne did not surrender because it did not have to. Its nation could sustain it through the air, rendering the ancient logic of siege warfare obsolete. What German soldiers witnessed on December 23, 1944, those 241 C-47s and the waves that followed, was not merely the relief of Bastogne. It was a preview of the future of warfare itself. Victory would belong to the nation capable of filling the sky with aircraft as effortlessly as others filled fields with infantry. In those descending parachutes, German soldiers saw the mathematics of American abundance, and in those numbers was written the fate of the Third Reich. The war would continue for another 5 months. But for the men who watched the sky above Bastogne filled with American aircraft, it effectively ended that clear December morning, when they understood that the 101st Airborne would never surrender, not because its soldiers were braver or more disciplined, but because their country would never allow them to fail. The aircraft over Bastogne did more than resupply a division. They destroyed the final illusions of German victory and inscribed the true outcome of the Second World War across the winter sky. America's industrial power was vast. Its resolve was unshakable. Its victory was inevitable. Those German soldiers knew this with certainty, even as their leaders denied it for 4 more months. In the skies over a small Belgian town, on a clear December morning, the war had already been decided. Note, some German soldier perspectives presented here are reconstructed from documented unit positions and post-war testimonies, as individual diaries from the siege are limited. All major events, dates, statistics, and commander statements are drawn from established historical sources.